The night presses in around you, heavy with an unsettling silence. The old house creaks and groans as the air grows colder, and though the walls are still, you can't shake the feeling that you're being watched. It's just a house, you tell yourself, but as the shadows grow longer, that feeling becomes undeniable. The floorboards groan under invisible footsteps, and whispers drift through the hallways, soft but unmistakable. Every room feels alive with something you can't see but can certainly feel. What secrets does this house hold? And what, if anything, is watching you from the dark corners where the light can't reach? It's only a matter of time before you know for sure. Is it possible that the mind can play tricks on us, or is it something far more sinister at work in the dead of night? The hour is 3 a.m. The world outside is still, eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. The chill of the air slips through cracks in the walls, a soft draft kissing the skin. Your heartbeat is steady, but with each passing moment, it seems to slow, every sound becoming more amplified. In the darkness, when the world is submerged in shadows, time itself seems to lose its meaning. The hour stretches, lingers. It's during these late hours, in the dead of night, when the veil between the living and the dead thins. The silence feels like something tangible, an entity that presses down on your chest, making it harder to breathe. In these moments, reality becomes a fragile thing. One small crack can send everything shattering, leaving you questioning what's real and what isn't. But tonight, it won't be a question of your mind playing tricks. No, tonight, something real will reach through that thin veil and grip you by the soul. The shadows of your room seem to lengthen, bending unnaturally, as if stretching towards you. You've felt it before, the strange sensation of eyes watching you, the presence of something unseen. It's a feeling so intense, you can almost hear it, a soft hum in the air, too faint to identify, yet too distinct to ignore. A rustle of fabric in the corner, a slight chill that sweeps through the room. You turn toward it, but there's nothing. Just the dark silence, swallowing up your thoughts. But the unease lingers. You try to shake it off, convincing yourself it's just the quiet tricks your mind is playing on you. After all, you know that the late hours can do that. Everyone's heard the stories, haven't they? The strange noises, the flickering lights, the shadows that move. But this is different. This isn't the flicker of a light bulb or the settling of an old house. This is something else. There's a noise, faint but clear, a soft creak from the hallway outside. It's subtle at first, almost imperceptible. But then it comes again, louder this time. A deliberate, almost calculated sound. The floorboards outside your door shift under an unseen weight, the slow groan of wood straining against the pressure. You freeze. Your mind races. It could be the house settling, could be just the wind outside, you tell yourself. But as your pulse quickens, you know that the stillness of the night has become too heavy. This is no longer the normal creaks and groans of an old building. This is different. The sound moves closer. You try to breathe, but your chest feels tight. The room seems to close in around you, as though the very walls are narrowing, pushing in on your sanity. Your heart pounds in your ears. The noise is louder now, unmistakable. It's coming from right outside your door. A slow, rhythmic tapping, like nails against the wood. You know that no one is supposed to be there. You live alone. There's no one in the house. But that doesn't stop the terror that rises in your throat. You reach for your phone, the familiar device that could give you some comfort, a distraction. Your hands tremble as you unlock it. The dim light of the screen only adds to the claustrophobic feeling growing in the pit of your stomach. You swipe through your contacts, but your fingers feel frozen, like they don't belong to you. You want to call someone, anyone, but the tapping doesn't stop. The sound is now joined by something else, a soft, breathy whisper, low and indistinct. It's coming from just beyond the door. You press your back into the bed, hoping the darkness will somehow protect you. You close your eyes, telling yourself that it's just a figment of your imagination, a product of your overactive mind. But the whispering doesn't stop. It's like a voice, but not quite, as if it's trying to form words but can't quite find the right ones. It's growing louder, more urgent. Your breath catches in your throat, and you know that whatever is on the other side of the door isn't trying to hide anymore. A chill runs down your spine, and you pull the covers up to your chin, the sheets doing little to comfort you. It's too quiet now, too still. The tapping stops, but the whispering continues. It doesn't make sense. Why would someone be outside your door at this hour? The rational part of your brain tells you it's just a dream, just a trick. But the fear coursing through your veins tells you otherwise. Then, there's a knock. Soft, yet unmistakable. The kind of knock that says, "I'm here and I'm not leaving." Your breath catches in your throat, your heart racing. You sit up, the sheets falling away, leaving you exposed, vulnerable. The room feels colder now, impossibly cold. Your breath fogs the air, and in that moment, you know that something is wrong. The knock comes again, louder this time, more insistent. You freeze, unable to move. The rational part of your brain is screaming at you to get up, to do something, anything. But fear has you rooted to the bed. You finally manage to pull yourself from the bed, the fear paralyzing your every movement. Your legs feel weak, like they can't hold your weight. Slowly, carefully you stand. The whispering has stopped, replaced by a stillness that seems to press against your ears. You inch toward the door, your breath shallow, your skin prickling with cold sweat. You reach for the handle, but before you can turn it, the door creaks open on its own. Your heart drops into your stomach. You didn't open it. You hadn't even touched the handle. Slowly, cautiously you step back. The door is now wide open, and in the doorway stands a figure shrouded in darkness. It's tall, too tall for a human. Its shape is indistinct, as though the shadows themselves have taken form, but you can feel its presence. The air is thick with something otherworldly, something suffocating. The whispering starts again, low and guttural, but this time, you can hear it more clearly. "Come closer," the voice croaks, each word dripping with malice. You step back, your mind screaming at you to run, but your legs refuse to obey. There is nowhere to go. The room seems to close in around you. The figure steps forward, and you can feel its cold breath on your skin. It's closer now, so close that you can smell the musty, decaying odor that clings to it, a smell that makes your stomach churn. You can't look away, even as your mind screams for you to do so. You want to scream, but your voice is caught in your throat. The figure reaches out, its long, skeletal fingers brushing against your arm. It's colder than anything you've ever felt, a biting cold that burns like ice. Your skin crawls, but your body won't move. You can't move. And then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanishes, leaving only the cold, oppressive silence in its wake. The door slams shut on its own, and the whispering stops. You stand frozen in place, your heart racing, your mind struggling to comprehend what just happened. Was it a dream? A hallucination? Or something worse, something that you don't want to acknowledge? The question lingers in the air long after the figure is gone. What was it that you encountered? And, more importantly, what was it that wanted you to know it was there? The silence now feels different, heavier, as though the room itself is waiting for something. The shadows on the walls seem to stretch even longer, reaching for you, pulling you deeper into the darkness. There's no comfort in this quiet. The only sound now is the beating of your own heart, pounding in your ears, a reminder that you are alone, but perhaps not entirely. The night had already begun to settle in, a heavy silence enveloping the house, broken only by the faint hum of an old ceiling fan overhead. Claire, who had only recently moved into the house, was sitting at the edge of her bed, staring at the shadows creeping across the walls. The room felt cold, despite the warm air circulating lazily in the stillness. She wrapped her arms around herself, hugging her knees, as the feeling of being watched returned. She had told herself it was just the unfamiliarity of the new space, just the normal anxiety that comes with adjusting to a new home. But something gnawed at her, an unsettling sense that she wasn't alone. Not in the way she should have been. The house, while quaint and charming on the surface, was old, and old houses have their quirks. It creaked and groaned at night, just as any building would. But these noises, these were different. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there in the hallway, just beyond her door, watching her. At first, it was just a strange instinct, an odd sense of presence that hovered at the edges of her awareness. But as the days passed, it became harder to ignore. She had noticed it the first night she spent there, the soft whispers. They weren't loud, not enough to make her jump out of bed in fear, but enough to make the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It was a sound like a breeze rustling through leaves, soft and distant, but somehow distinctly human. As if someone was whispering just out of her earshot. She thought it was just the wind, the house settling. But then it happened again the next night. And the next. It was on the fourth night that Claire decided to confront it. She had spent the evening unpacking, trying to settle in, trying to make the house feel more like home. But now, as she lay in bed, she could hear it again, the faint sound of murmured voices coming from the hallway. At first, it seemed like nothing more than the echoes of the house. Perhaps it was the wind again, or the floorboards creaking under their own weight. But as the whispers grew louder, sharper, a chill ran through her. This wasn't just the wind. This was something else. Her heart began to race, and her breathing quickened. The whispering was unmistakable now. It was as though someone was standing right outside her bedroom door, speaking to her, just loud enough to hear. It wasn't a language she recognized, but it felt ancient, like a voice from another time, another place. Claire pulled the covers tighter around herself, the warmth from the blankets doing little to comfort her. The whispers seemed to seep into her mind, wrapping around her thoughts like tendrils of fog. She felt a strange pull, a magnetic force that urged her to get up, to go toward the sound. With a deep breath, she pushed the blankets aside and slowly swung her legs over the side of the bed. The cold of the wooden floor sent a shiver up her spine as she stood. She hesitated for a moment, the tension in the air almost suffocating. But the whispers called to her. They had to be real, didn't they? She wasn't imagining this. She had heard them every night, growing louder, more insistent. Claire moved cautiously toward the door, her feet heavy on the floor, as though something invisible was weighing them down. The whispers became clearer as she approached, and the air around her grew colder. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a split second, she almost backed away. She had no idea what she might find on the other side. The rational part of her brain screamed for her to turn back, to ignore it, to lock the door and go back to bed. But the curiosity, no, the need to know what was causing this, overpowered her fear. She turned the doorknob slowly, the creak of the door almost too loud in the silence. The hallway outside was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the windows. Her breath formed small clouds in front of her face as the cold air seemed to intensify. She stepped into the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers stopped immediately, as though they had been waiting for her to make her move. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Claire's eyes scanned the hallway, searching for any sign of movement. There was nothing. No one was there. She took another step forward, then another, her footsteps muffled by the carpet beneath her feet. As she walked down the hallway, she noticed something strange, a faint trail of footprints in the dust on the floor, leading from the staircase to the closed door of the guest room. The prints were fresh, as though someone had walked through the house only moments before. But who? She was alone. She had made sure of that before she went to bed. There was no one else here. Her pulse quickened as she followed the trail, her mind racing with questions she didn't want to answer. What was going on in this house? Was she losing her mind? Or was something else at play here, something far more sinister? The whispers had stopped, but the unease remained, crawling under her skin like 1,000 tiny insects. She reached the guest room door and hesitated, her hand shaking as she grasped the doorknob. She didn't want to open it, didn't want to face whatever lay behind it. But something inside her urged her on. She had to know. She turned the knob, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. The room was empty, just as it had been when she first moved in. The bed was untouched, the furniture still covered in dust sheets. But as her eyes scanned the room, they landed on the window. It was wide open. Claire stepped into the room, her breath hitching as she approached the window. The air outside was cold, the night sky clear and full of stars. But there was something about the open window that felt wrong. She could have sworn she had closed it earlier that day, yet now it stood wide open, the curtains fluttering gently in the breeze. Suddenly she heard it again, a soft sound, like a whisper, But this time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the corner of the room. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she whipped around, her eyes searching frantically. But again, there was nothing. No one. A shiver ran down her spine as she realized the whispers had not been in her mind after all. They were real. Something, or someone, was here. The fear hit her in waves, crashing over her like a tidal wave. She wanted to run, to scream, to escape the house entirely, but her feet felt like lead, her body frozen in place. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. Was there a history to this house? Had someone else lived here before her, someone who hadn't quite left? She thought back to the previous owners. They had sold the house quickly, almost too quickly. Had they known something she didn't? Claire took one last look around the room, her gaze landing on the mirror above the dresser. For just a moment, she thought she saw something. A flicker of movement, a shadow in the reflection. She blinked, but when she looked again, it was gone. Her breath quickened, her heart racing as the sense of being watched grew even stronger. The whispers were louder now, almost frantic. And in the reflection of the mirror, she could have sworn she saw someone standing behind her. But when she turned around, the room was empty. The coldness of the air pressed in around her, suffocating her, and for the first time, Claire realized that she might never be alone in this house again. Max had never been one to believe in the supernatural. Growing up in a small town, he was always the practical one, the skeptic. His friends would talk about strange happenings in their homes, weird noises, or eerie feelings, but Max always shrugged it off as overactive imaginations. But then came that mirror. It started off innocently enough. Max had moved into his new apartment, a modest one-bedroom with a large bathroom, nothing fancy but perfect for his needs. He'd been working long hours, barely having time to unpack his things, but one thing he'd noticed right away was the old mirror that hung on the bathroom wall. It was the kind of mirror you'd expect to find in a thrift store, ornate, with a tarnished gold frame that had seen better days. Max didn't think much of it at first, it was just a mirror, after all. It was only after a few weeks that he began to notice something strange about it. It wasn't the mirror itself, at least not at first. It was the way it seemed to catch the light. No matter how he positioned himself, no matter how much he tried to adjust the lighting in the bathroom, the mirror always seemed to reflect more than it should. It was as though the light bent around it in unnatural ways. The reflection wasn't quite right. It was blurry, distorted, like it was trying to show something that wasn't there. The first time Max really noticed it, he'd been brushing his teeth, staring into the mirror as he worked through his routine. His reflection seemed normal enough, but there was something off about the way his face looked. It wasn't quite as sharp, not as clear. At first, he chalked it up to tiredness, the late hours at work catching up with him. But the feeling lingered, like a nagging thought at the back of his mind. He finished brushing his teeth, washed his face, and turned to leave, but something made him stop. His reflection didn't move as quickly as he did. Max turned back toward the mirror, frowning. His reflection was still, almost frozen, staring back at him with an intensity he hadn't noticed before. He blinked, but the reflection remained locked in place, the image of himself almost too perfect, too still. Max's pulse quickened, and he stepped closer to the mirror, his face inches from the glass. The reflection remained static, but something else was different. He couldn't quite place it, but there was something wrong about the way his own image stared back at him. His mind raced, and for a moment, Max thought he might have been seeing things. Perhaps it was the dim lighting, perhaps it was the exhaustion from his long day. He turned away again, trying to push the feeling aside, but as he walked toward the door, he caught a glimpse of something in the mirror out of the corner of his eye. His reflection moved. The slightest shift of his head, just enough to make it seem like the figure in the mirror was aware of him. Max froze. He spun back around to face the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. There was nothing there, just the normal reflection of his own face. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. Maybe he was just tired, maybe the stress of work had gotten to him. He couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Over the next few days, Max couldn't shake the unease that the mirror stirred in him. It was like it was watching him, waiting for something. Every time he walked into the bathroom, his gaze would be drawn to it, and every time he would find himself searching for any sign that the reflection was more than just a reflection. Sometimes, when he was brushing his teeth or washing his face, he would glance into the mirror and swear that his reflection wasn't quite in sync with his movements. It was subtle, too subtle to explain, and that was what made it so terrifying. The strangest thing, however, was the figure. It started small, just the occasional flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. But as the days passed, the figure in the mirror became more distinct. It was an old man with graying hair and a weathered face. He was dressed in a dark suit, and his eyes, though distant, seemed to hold a sorrow that Max couldn't understand. At first, Max thought he was imagining things. It was just his mind playing tricks on him, surely. But the more he looked, the clearer the figure became. Max tried to ignore it. He would turn his back to the mirror and tell himself it was just a trick of the light. But no matter how hard he tried to avoid it, the figure grew more present. It wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was a person. Max began to feel like he was being drawn into the reflection, like the figure was beckoning him, urging him to step closer. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck prickle whenever he entered the bathroom. The mirror seemed to pull him in, hold him there. He knew he needed to get rid of it, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. There was something about the figure that kept him rooted in place. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Max found himself in the bathroom once again. He'd barely even registered walking in, his mind too preoccupied with the stress of the day. He reached for the faucet to wash his face when he caught a glimpse of the figure in the mirror. This time, the figure was standing much closer. In fact, it was so close to the glass that Max could see the faint outline of the old man's features, his face twisted in a look of quiet desperation. Max's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure. He wanted to look away, but something kept him rooted in place. The old man's eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. The man's lips moved, but no sound came out. Max leaned closer, his mind racing with questions. What was this? Was he dreaming? Was this some sort of hallucination brought on by exhaustion? Max reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the cool surface of the mirror. The moment his fingers made contact, the reflection in the glass moved, not his own reflection, but the figure of the old man. The figure stepped back as though it was trying to get away from him, its eyes wide with fear. Max recoiled, his heart pounding in his chest. He quickly pulled his hand away from the mirror, but the old man's eyes remained fixed on him, desperate, pleading. Max stumbled backward, his legs giving out beneath him as he tried to escape the bathroom. But before he could make it to the door, the mirror began to warp. The glass seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone, distorting the image of the old man's face. It twisted, shifted, and then the figure reached out, reaching for him, its fingers pressing against the glass. Max froze, a surge of terror washing over him as the mirror seemed to come alive. He stumbled to his feet, backing away from the mirror, but the figure followed him. Every step Max took, the reflection moved in sync with him. It wasn't just the figure of the old man anymore. The entire mirror seemed to have come to life, its surface rippling like a stormy sea. Max could hear the old man's voice now, faint and distorted, like an echo coming from deep underwater. "You can't leave," the voice whispered, barely audible. "You'll never leave." Max's breath hitched in his throat as the figure reached out once more, its hand pressing against the glass, its face contorting in an expression of agony. The mirror seemed to pull him closer, and for a moment, Max thought he might be sucked in. The reflection was pulling him toward it, drawing him into its depths. His heart raced as he fought to keep his distance, but the mirror seemed to grow larger, more imposing. With a final burst of adrenaline, Max snapped out of his paralysis. He turned and bolted from the bathroom, his heart pounding in his chest as he ran out of the apartment. He didn't stop until he was outside, breathing in the cold night air, his body trembling from head to toe. The figure, the mirror, it didn't matter anymore. Max couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened in that bathroom was not just a trick of the mind. The mirror wasn't just reflecting his image. It was showing him something else, something far darker. Emily had always dreamed of having a family. For years, she and her partner, Aaron, had been preparing for this moment, the moment they could bring a child into their home and make it a place filled with laughter and love. So when they found out they were expecting, it felt like everything was falling into place. They moved into a charming house on the edge of town, a quiet, peaceful place that seemed perfect for raising a child. The neighborhood was calm, the people were friendly, and the house had a warmth to it that immediately made Emily feel at ease. They painted the nursery a soft shade of yellow, set up the crib, and filled the shelves with stuffed animals and books. It was everything they had ever wanted. But as the weeks passed and Emily's pregnancy progressed, something began to change in the house, something that made her skin crawl and her heart race. It started with the baby's cries. At first, it was faint, barely audible, like the distant sound of a baby wailing in the night. Emily didn't think much of it at first. She assumed it was coming from a neighbor's house, or maybe a passing car with its radio turned up too loud. But as the days went by, the cries became more distinct, more insistent. They seemed to echo through the walls, a soft, mournful wail that made her blood run cold. The first time she heard it clearly, she was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when the sound suddenly filled the room. It was so clear, so real, that she jumped out of her seat in surprise, her heart pounding in her chest. She rushed to the window, hoping to see a neighbor's baby, but there was nothing. The street was silent. The cry seemed to come from inside the house itself. Aaron didn't hear it at first. He was busy with work, distracted by his own things. Emily tried to explain it to him, but he just shrugged it off. He said it was probably just the old pipes, the house settling, or maybe even the wind playing tricks on her. He told her not to worry about it, that it was probably nothing. But Emily knew what she had heard. The cry was real. It was coming from somewhere inside the house, and it was growing louder with each passing night. She began to feel an unease she couldn't shake, a constant knot of tension in her stomach. She couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. The sound of the baby's cries seemed to follow her wherever she went, echoing through the hallways, creeping into every room. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the cries became harder to dismiss. They were too real, too desperate. One night, unable to sleep, Emily decided to investigate. She got up from bed, careful not to wake Aaron, and walked through the dark house, following the sound of the cries. It was strange, she thought, how the sound seemed to move, to shift from one room to another. She thought it was coming from the nursery at first, but when she opened the door, the room was empty, the crib still, the yellow walls bathed in the soft glow of the nightlight. No baby. She stepped back into the hallway, her heart racing. The cry was louder now, almost frantic, and it seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. Emily stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. She knew she had to find out where it was coming from. She couldn't just ignore it any longer. The sound led her to the kitchen, then to the basement door. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. The basement was cold, dark, and uninviting. They hadn't really used it much since moving in. There were old boxes of things from the previous owners, and a musty smell that seemed to cling to the air. Emily knew that the house had its oddities, but this felt different. The baby's cries were now a constant, gut-wrenching wail that made her stomach churn. She opened the basement door slowly, the creak of the hinges echoing through the silent house. The darkness below seemed to stretch endlessly, and the air grew colder, denser, as though something was waiting for her. She stepped cautiously onto the basement stairs, her hand tightly gripping the railing. The baby's cries were deafening now, so loud that they drowned out everything else. She reached the bottom of the stairs and turned on the light, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. There, in the far corner of the basement, was a small, wooden cradle. It was rocking gently back and forth, though there was no baby inside. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The cradle was empty, but the cries came from it, louder than ever, as if the sound itself was emanating from the very wood of the cradle. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she stepped back, unsure of what she was seeing. Was this some kind of twisted joke? Was she imagining it? The cries continued, louder now, almost suffocating in their intensity. And then, for just a moment, the wailing stopped. In that brief silence, Emily thought she heard something else. A whisper, faint and breathy, coming from the darkness. "Help me," it said, the voice barely audible. The words sent a jolt of terror through her, and she turned to flee, but her legs felt like lead. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick, heavy, and as the whispering grew louder, she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. Something was in the basement with her, something that didn't want her to leave. She spun around, desperate to escape, but the stairs seemed to stretch farther and farther away, as if the house itself was pulling her down into the darkness. And then, as if in answer to her panic, the crying began again, but this time, it was accompanied by something else, something far worse. The sound of a baby's laugh. It was a soft giggle, almost childlike, but there was something wrong with it. It sounded hollow, like the laugh of something that had long since died. Emily's legs finally gave way beneath her, and she fell to her knees, her body trembling with fear. She looked around frantically, but the basement was still empty. The cradle continued to rock, the eerie laugh echoing in her ears, and the cries seemed to twist and distort, becoming more frantic, more desperate. With a final, frantic push, Emily scrambled up the stairs, her hand gripping the railing as she pulled herself to her feet. She didn't look back. She didn't care what was in the basement anymore. She only wanted to get out, to escape from whatever was haunting this house. She rushed back through the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest, and slammed the door to the nursery shut behind her. The laughter and cries faded as she collapsed onto the bed, gasping for air. She tried to calm herself, tried to tell herself that it was just her imagination, that she had been dreaming. But deep down, she knew better. The baby's cries didn't stop. They continued to echo through the walls, through the floors, through her mind, relentless and all-consuming. Emily closed her eyes, hoping for some relief, but the sound only grew louder. It was as though the house itself was alive, feeding on her fear, drawing her deeper into its grasp. She knew now that it wasn't just a haunting. It was something far worse, something that had been waiting for her, waiting for them all along. And it wasn't going to let them leave. Marcus had always been the kind of person who dismissed strange occurrences as mere coincidences or the result of overactive imaginations. As a child, his parents had raised him to be logical, grounded in reality, and as he grew older, those lessons stuck. So when Marcus moved into his new apartment, an old, sprawling building in the heart of the city, he didn't think much about the strange noises or the feeling of being watched that seemed to follow him throughout the first few nights. He figured it was just the usual creaks and groans of an old structure, or maybe the paranoia of being in an unfamiliar place. But it didn't take long for him to realize that this building, this apartment, was far from ordinary. It started one evening when Marcus was unpacking in his new living room. The apartment was on the top floor, with large windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. He had just gotten home from work, his muscles sore from the move, and he was in the process of arranging his furniture when the first incident occurred. It wasn't much, just a slight, almost imperceptible sound, like a distant knock at the door. He paused, confused, wondering if perhaps he had imagined it. But when he looked around, there was no one there. He chalked it up to the building settling, or maybe the wind. After all, it wasn't uncommon for older buildings to make strange noises. However, over the next few days, the sounds started to intensify. It was no longer just an occasional knock. At night, as Marcus sat alone in his living room, reading or watching TV, he could hear footsteps in the hallway outside. Soft, slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking just outside his door. He would get up, open the door, and find nothing. No one in the hallway, no signs of anyone having passed by. The building was old, and he supposed it was possible that the walls were thin, that the sounds from the neighbors' apartments carried. But even the most rational part of his mind couldn't explain the feeling of eyes on him, a presence that seemed to hover just beyond his sight. It wasn't long before the nightmares began. The first one was vague, nothing more than a fleeting sense of terror that faded the moment he woke up. But as the days passed, the dreams grew darker, more vivid. In these dreams, he would walk through his apartment, the space feeling off, unfamiliar. It was always the same, a sense of something lurking, hidden in the shadows. At times, he would wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, his body frozen with fear, but there was always one detail that stuck with him. In every dream, there was someone in the corner of his living room, standing just out of his line of sight. The figure was never clear, always blurred, but Marcus knew it was watching him. The eyes were the most disturbing part, eyes that he couldn't see, but that he felt were burning into him, waiting. One evening, after yet another unsettling night of dreams, Marcus decided to stay up late, hoping to catch whatever it was that had been disturbing his sleep. The apartment was eerily quiet, the hum of the city below distant and muffled by the old walls. It was close to 3 a.m., the witching hour when everything seemed to shift, when the world felt just a little too strange, a little too unreal. He sat in the living room, the faint light of the lamp casting long shadows across the floor. He tried to focus on the TV, but every rustle of the air, every creak of the floorboards, made him jump. His nerves were frayed, and he couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. The silence in the apartment stretched, suffocating. Then, just as he began to convince himself that it was all in his head, he heard it again, soft at first, just a faint tapping sound. It came from the wall, just beside the living room window. Marcus froze, his breath catching in his throat. The tap was rhythmic, almost deliberate. He got up from the couch, his feet feeling heavy as he approached the wall, the hairs on his neck standing on end. He pressed his ear against it, straining to hear. The sound stopped. For a moment, the silence returned. But then it came again, closer this time, more urgent. A knocking not from the wall, but from within the wall itself. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped back, suddenly aware of the oppressive stillness that hung in the air. The sound was unmistakable, and it seemed to come from behind the plaster. It was as if something or someone was trapped in the wall, trying to get out. His mind raced with possibilities, old plumbing, pipes shifting, maybe even rats scurrying about, but a cold shiver ran down his spine as the tapping continued, louder now, more insistent. Marcus backed away from the wall, feeling a strange compulsion to leave the apartment. The idea of being in this place alone, with whatever was making that sound, was too much. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, but just as he reached for the handle, something stopped him. A voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Leave now," it said, the words cold and menacing. The voice echoed in his mind, sending a wave of terror over him. For a moment, he stood frozen, unable to move. The voice wasn't just in his ears, it was in his head, in his thoughts. He could hear it, feel it, but when he turned around, the apartment was still empty, the only sound the persistent tapping from the walls. He could feel the presence, though, something watching him, waiting. His skin crawled, and without thinking, he rushed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. Marcus didn't go back that night. He couldn't. He spent the rest of the evening at a friend's place, his mind racing with questions, his pulse pounding in his ears. What was happening to him? What was in that apartment? His logical mind tried to piece it together, but every explanation felt inadequate, like there was something just beyond his understanding, something that didn't belong in the realm of the living. The next day he returned to his apartment, his steps slow and hesitant. The building seemed quieter in the daylight, the sounds of the city filtering in through the open windows. The tapping had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. He couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest, the gnawing sensation that whatever had been in the apartment was still there, waiting for him to make the next move. Marcus decided to investigate. He couldn't just ignore it. He had to know what was causing the strange noises, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. Armed with a flashlight, he moved through the apartment, checking every nook and cranny, inspecting the walls, the floorboards, and the windows. Nothing. No signs of any intruder, no strange marks on the walls, no cracks in the foundation. But when he reached the living room, his eyes were drawn to the corner of the room, the place he had seen in his dreams. The space was dim, the shadows cast by the furniture stretching across the floor. For a moment, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But as Marcus stared into the corner, a flicker of movement caught his eye. His heart skipped a beat as he saw it, the figure. It was blurry at first, like the shadow of someone standing just out of sight, but as he focused, the figure became clearer. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in old, ragged clothes. His face was obscured, a darkness that seemed to swallow any light that touched it. Marcus blinked, and the figure was gone, as if it had never been there. He stepped forward, his breath shallow, and for a moment he thought he might be losing his mind. But there was no denying it. Something was in this apartment with him. Something that didn't want him there. The figure had been real, and it was waiting. Marcus turned, but the tapping from the walls started again, now more frantic, more desperate. The whispers grew louder, the words incomprehensible, but filled with malice. He knew then that whatever was in the apartment was not just trying to communicate, it was trying to trap him, to draw him into its world, into the darkness that had taken root in this building. With his heart hammering in his chest, Marcus turned and fled. He didn't stop until he was outside, the cool night air hitting his face, his body trembling with fear. As he looked back at the building, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, waiting for him to return. And for the first time, Marcus realized that some things couldn't be explained, some things didn't belong in the world of the living. The apartment wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And it wanted him. Grace had always prided herself on her ability to stay calm under pressure. As a lawyer, she had spent years learning to control her emotions, to think logically and make decisions based on facts. But when she moved into the old house on the outskirts of town, all her years of training seemed to vanish. The house had a charm to it, an air of quiet dignity, but there was something in its walls, something in its floors and shadows, that unsettled her. It started with small things, things she could easily brush off. A flicker of movement in the corner of her vision, the sound of footsteps when she was alone, the occasional cold spot in the middle of the room. But soon, the little things escalated, and Grace found herself questioning her own sanity. It was a Saturday afternoon when it all began to unravel. Grace had spent the day unpacking, trying to get her new home in order. She had always dreamed of living in an old house like this, spacious, full of character, and with a story to tell. The house had been empty for years, and when she first saw it, she felt an immediate connection. The wooden floors creaked under her weight, the old furniture had a timeless quality to it, and the walls seemed to echo with whispers of the past. She imagined the generations that had lived there before her, the memories embedded in the very fabric of the house. But as night fell and she was left alone in the silence, the house seemed to shift. That afternoon, Grace had been sitting at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee, when she felt a sudden chill. She had thought nothing of it at first. After all, the house was old, and the drafts in the walls were inevitable. But as she stood to grab a sweater from the closet, she noticed something strange. A picture on the wall had shifted. It was a framed photo of the house, taken years ago when it was still in its prime. The photo was slightly crooked, the edges of the frame catching the light in an odd way. Grace had been sure that she had hung it straight, but now it was askew, as if someone had touched it recently. She frowned, stepping closer to adjust it, but as she reached out, a cold wind rushed past her, making her shiver. She pulled her hand back, startled, and looked around. The air felt heavy, thick, as if the house itself was watching her. That night, as she settled into bed, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She tried to tell herself it was just the newness of the house, the unfamiliarity of it all, but the feeling persisted. She turned off the lights and pulled the covers up to her chin, but the darkness seemed to press in around her, suffocating. She lay there in the stillness, her eyes wide open, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. For what seemed like hours, she listened to the quiet hum of the night, until she heard it. A soft, scraping sound, like nails on wood. It was coming from the hallway outside her bedroom. Her heart skipped a beat, and she sat up in bed, staring at the door, her breath shallow and quick. At first, she told herself it was just the house settling. The old floorboards creaked and groaned all the time, especially at night when the temperature dropped. But the sound didn't stop. It persisted, rhythmic and steady, like someone, or something, was dragging something heavy across the floor. Grace's mind raced, her eyes darting to the dark hallway beyond her bedroom door. The house was silent except for that sound. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it was just the wind or a pipe, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. It was too deliberate, too constant. She finally decided to get up and check. She opened the door slowly, trying not to make a sound, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway was dark, but she could just make out the outline of the stairs leading to the attic. The scraping sound had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. She stood there for a moment, frozen, listening for any hint of movement. Nothing. But as she started to close the door, the sound returned, this time much louder, closer. It was coming from upstairs. Grace's instincts screamed at her to turn around, to leave the house, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. She had to know what it was. She had to face it. She grabbed the flashlight from her nightstand and made her way up the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. As she reached the top of the stairs, she hesitated. The attic door was ajar, just slightly, enough to allow a sliver of darkness to spill into the hallway. The scraping sound was louder now, almost frantic. She walked toward the door, her hand shaking as she reached for the handle. When she opened the door, the flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the attic. There, in the center of the room, was an old wooden chest. The sound was coming from inside. Grace's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She could feel the weight of the air in the attic, thick and suffocating. She knew she should turn around, leave the room, but she couldn't. The curiosity, the need to understand, was too strong. With a trembling hand, she reached for the latch of the chest and pulled it open. The scraping sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a thick silence. Grace looked inside, but the chest was empty. There was nothing inside except for old, decaying paper, remnants of what might have once been a letter or a photograph, now too faded to make out. She frowned, confused, but as she stood there, the temperature in the attic seemed to drop. A cold breeze rushed past her, making her skin prickle with fear. She could hear something now, a faint whisper, a voice just beyond her comprehension. It was soft, low, but unmistakable. It was saying her name. Grace. She spun around, the flashlight darting across the attic, but there was no one there. The room was empty, still, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Her pulse raced as she backed away from the chest, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The whispering grew louder, and now she could hear footsteps, soft and deliberate, coming from behind her. She turned, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. Just the empty, shadow-filled attic. The whispers grew into incoherent murmurs, like voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Panic surged through her, and she ran from the attic, slamming the door behind her. Her heart hammered in her chest as she descended the stairs, her legs weak beneath her. She was trembling, drenched in cold sweat, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just experienced. The house was haunted, there was no denying it now. But the question was, by whom? What was it that lingered in these walls, in the corners of this house, watching her, waiting for her to uncover its secrets? Grace tried to calm herself as she returned to the living room. The lights seemed dimmer now, the shadows deeper, and the silence heavier. She sat down on the couch, trying to steady her breathing, but it was no use. The house was alive in a way that terrified her, its presence creeping into every corner of her mind. She knew that whatever it wasn't going to let her go. She had disturbed something, uncovered something that should have been left alone. And now, the house was making sure she knew it. The whispering had stopped, but she could feel it, that sense of being watched, that ever-present presence that seemed to follow her wherever she went. The walls had eyes. The air had ears. And Grace was trapped in a place that wasn't hers, a place where the past lingered like a dark stain, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to claim her. She had no choice now but to wait, to see what came next. Because in that house, there was no escaping the past. There was no escaping whatever it was that lived there. Liam had always been skeptical of ghost stories. He had grown up surrounded by tales of haunted houses and restless spirits, but he had always brushed them off as mere folklore, stories meant to frighten children or entertain at parties, nothing more. He was a man of reason, a scientist by profession, someone who believed in the tangible, the measurable, and the logical. But that all changed when he took a job as a researcher in a small, historic town nestled in the mountains. The job seemed simple enough: conducting surveys, gathering historical data, and occasionally working with the local museum to curate exhibits. It was a temporary position, something he hoped would give him some peace after a string of personal losses and a particularly difficult divorce. He had no idea what he was walking into. The town itself was charming, with cobblestone streets lined with old brick buildings that seemed to have been frozen in time. Liam rented a small apartment above a bookstore, a cozy place with creaky wooden floors and large windows that overlooked the main square. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the routine of unpacking and getting to know the town. But there was something off about the place, something Liam couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't the town itself, no, it was the people. They were kind, but there was a palpable distance in their eyes, a wariness that made Liam uncomfortable. They didn't speak much about the town's history, and whenever the subject of the old houses and abandoned buildings came up, they quickly changed the subject. It was as if they were all carrying a secret, one they weren't willing to share. It wasn't long before Liam began to notice strange occurrences in his own apartment. At first, it was small things: books mysteriously falling off shelves, doors that would be open when he was certain he had closed them. He convinced himself it was just the natural settling of an old building, nothing to be concerned about. But one night, as he sat at his desk working on some research, he heard a soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. He looked up, startled, but there was nothing outside. The street below was empty, the dim light of the street lamps casting long shadows on the cobblestones. He went back to his work, but the tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. It was coming from the window again. This time, he stood up and approached it cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached the window, the tapping stopped. He pulled back the curtain, expecting to find a bird or a branch, but there was nothing. Just the empty street, bathed in moonlight. Liam shook his head, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up his spine. "It's just your imagination," he told himself. But as the days went by, the strange occurrences only grew more frequent. The tapping continued, always at night, and sometimes, when he would lie in bed, he could hear footsteps in the hallway outside his door, slow and deliberate, as though someone were walking in the shadows just beyond his reach. He'd open the door, but each time, there would be nothing. No one, no sounds, no signs of any movement. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he walked through the apartment, and the eerie feeling of being watched never left him. Then came the dreams. They started out as vague, fragmented images. A dark figure standing at the foot of his bed, whispering his name, the sensation of being pulled into a void. At first, Liam dismissed them as stress, the result of his mind working overtime. But as the dreams continued, they grew more vivid, more real. In one, he found himself standing in the town square, the same one he had seen from his window countless times, but it was different now. The streets were shrouded in fog, the buildings twisted and decayed, their windows dark and lifeless. And standing at the center of the square was a figure, tall, cloaked in shadow, its face obscured. It called to him, its voice deep and cold, and as he stepped forward, he felt the ground beneath him shift, as if the very earth were alive, writhing beneath his feet. In the next moment, he was falling into darkness. He awoke with a jolt, his body drenched in sweat, his heart racing. The dream was still fresh in his mind, the images so vivid that he could almost feel the cold fog on his skin. The dreams became a nightly occurrence, each one more intense than the last. He tried to dismiss them as the result of stress or perhaps the influence of the strange town, but deep down he knew something was wrong. Something was pulling at him, drawing him into a place he didn't understand. One evening, after a particularly unsettling dream, Liam decided to investigate the history of the town. He spent hours at the local library, poring over old newspapers and books, trying to piece together the town's past. He discovered that the town had a dark history, one that the locals seemed eager to forget. The original settlers had come to the area over a century ago, but shortly after they arrived, strange disappearances began to occur. People would vanish without a trace, and in some cases, entire families were wiped out in the dead of night. The town was plagued by mysterious deaths, and many believed that it was cursed, that the land itself was somehow to blame. But the town's history wasn't just filled with tragedy, it was also marked by a series of disappearances that had happened in recent years, particularly in the area where Liam was staying. People had gone missing without explanation, and the police had never been able to solve the cases. As he read on, Liam's stomach churned. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that the town's history was far darker than he had initially thought. It wasn't just the past that haunted this place, it was the present. The town had become a prison of sorts, a place where the living were trapped by the weight of its history, unable to escape the ghosts of the past. That night, the tapping returned, louder than ever. It was almost rhythmic now, like a morbid lullaby echoing through the walls of his apartment. Liam's pulse quickened as he stood up from his desk, his body frozen in place. The sound was coming from all around him, from the walls, from the ceiling, from the floor. It was as if the very apartment itself was alive, trying to communicate with him, trying to get him to listen. He walked to the window again, but this time, as he pulled back the curtain, he saw something he hadn't expected, someone standing in the street below, staring up at him. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by the shadows. The man didn't move, didn't even blink. He simply stood there, staring up at Liam's window with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Liam's heart pounded in his chest as he backed away from the window, his mind racing. Who was this person? What did he want? He grabbed his coat and rushed downstairs, his footsteps echoing in the empty building. The street outside was empty, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. There was no sign of the man. He turned back toward the apartment, his mind whirling with confusion and fear. He had to know what was happening, had to find out the truth. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever had been happening in this town, whatever had been happening to him, it was no coincidence. It was real, and it was waiting for him to uncover the answers. With newfound determination, Liam set out to explore the town, to uncover the truth behind its dark history. He walked through the streets, past the old houses and abandoned buildings, each one whispering secrets, each one holding a story that had yet to be told. As he reached the center of town, the fog rolled in, thick and suffocating, and he could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. The town was alive in a way that he couldn't explain, its secrets hidden beneath layers of time, waiting for someone to uncover them. And Liam knew deep down that he was the one meant to do it. The town had been waiting for him, just as the spirits had been waiting. There was no turning back now. The mystery was his to solve. And whatever awaited him, whatever truth he uncovered, would change everything. Sophie had always prided herself on her ability to adapt. As a travel writer, she had been to places most people could only dream of, remote villages in the Himalayas, bustling markets in Morocco, quiet villages in the south of France, and she had always found a way to feel at home, no matter how different the place was. But when she moved into the old Victorian house on the edge of town, she felt an overwhelming sense of unease that she couldn't shake. The house was beautiful, with its grand staircase, ornate woodwork, and towering windows that let in streams of light. It was exactly the kind of place she had dreamed of owning, a perfect spot for her to write her next book and enjoy some peace after years of constant travel. But as soon as she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. It wasn't the house itself. The house was fine, structurally sound and well-maintained. But there was an energy there, an invisible weight that pressed down on her chest every time she entered a room. She could feel it more in the evenings, when the sun began to set and the shadows in the house grew longer. There were moments when she would be sitting in the study, typing away at her laptop, only to feel a sudden chill creep down her spine. The hairs on the back of her neck would stand on end, and she would have the distinct feeling that someone was watching her. She tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to nerves or the natural settling of a house that had been empty for so long. But as the days went by, the feeling didn't go away. It grew stronger, more intense, and Sophie found herself avoiding certain rooms, certain corners of the house where the feeling was most pronounced. One night, after a long day of writing, Sophie decided to take a walk around the property. She had been cooped up inside for days, and she needed some fresh air. The house was situated on several acres of land, with a garden that had long been overrun by weeds, and a dense forest that bordered the back of the property. She had never explored the grounds before, but tonight, something drew her outside. The air was cool and crisp, the sky clear, and the moon cast a soft light over everything. As she walked toward the edge of the garden, she noticed something strange. There, half hidden in the overgrown ivy, was a stone path that led into the woods. It was narrow, almost hidden from view, and the moment she saw it, she felt an irresistible pull to follow it. Without thinking, Sophie stepped onto the path and began to walk. The deeper she went into the woods, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The air grew heavier, denser, and the silence was almost suffocating. She could hear nothing except the soft crunch of leaves beneath her feet and the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. The path twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the forest, away from the house. It felt like she was walking through another world, a world that existed outside of time, and the further she went, the more the oppressive feeling of being watched grew. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was nothing there, just the empty darkness of the woods behind her. Still, the feeling wouldn't leave her. It was as if something unseen was lurking just beyond her line of sight, waiting, observing. She quickened her pace, trying to shake the uneasy feeling, but the path seemed to stretch on forever. Eventually, the path led her to a small clearing, and in the center of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated well. The stone walls were covered in moss, and the wood covering the top was rotting, barely held together by rusted nails. Sophie stopped a few feet away from the well, her heart pounding in her chest. Something about it seemed off, as if it had been waiting for her, as if it had been here for years, watching, waiting for someone to come. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to approach it, her curiosity outweighing her fear. As she got closer, she saw something strange in the well, a faint, swirling mist that seemed to rise up from the depths. It wasn't natural. It didn't belong. Sophie crouched down, staring into the well, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The mist seemed to pulse, to shift, and as she watched, something began to form within it. A face. Pale and gaunt, its features distorted and blurred, as though it was a reflection in a cracked mirror. Sophie recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. The face was there, then gone, replaced by nothing but the swirling mist.